when a judge brings down a verdict, he's not just deciding on guilt or innocence, he's deciding on the professionalism of the police and how they do their job. And I like the idea that you're being tested that way.
The tragic story of Jane Doe began when the body of a woman was found covered in plastic bags under a railway pass.
She was a young girl. She was only 22.
She was somebody that didn't deserve to die. Clearly the blow from a blunt instrument, and there's something in her throat.
Detectives have stepped up efforts to identify the body of a young woman found murdered at Arncliffe.
Detectives were stumped because they couldn't identify Jane Doe.
They were going to make this a cold case. This was going to go on the back burner.
There was pressure from above. We're starting to really get frustrated. We'll probably identify the offender before we've identified the victim.
Good morning, Sydney, and what a beautiful day we've got ahead of us. Very hot and humid. Maybe a shower or two developing later on, and we're coming up now to 6:30 on the hour.
Well, it was a Saturday morning. I was a homicide detective attached to the South Region Homicide Squad. I'd come in, we had some minor work in the office. We were moving files around, so I was actually dressed in mufti. I was in a t-shirt and slacks instead of the usual collar and tie. At some point in the early morning, we got a call from the Cogra detectives about a homicide that had occurred involving a body found in Guess Avenue. We got very quickly into the cars and down to Guess Avenue in Arncliffe. It was the first job I had as the case officer in charge of an investigation. Okay, let's make sure we get everything right and we do the best possible job we can. The area is a light industrial area. Guess Avenue is dissected by a railway overpass. Where the body was dumped was outside a cement works on a grassy verge. The body was in black and orange plastic bags. It was a young girl. We thought somewhere between 17 and 20. She was dressed in a halter top that was white with very brief shorts that were houndstooth pattern. She had a Seiko watch on the left hand, brown band, gold face with Roman numerals. She did have pink socks on, which probably suggested she wore shoes with this outfit. Thank you. Yeah, these are crime scene photos from Guess Avenue. At the scene, when we actually moved the body, we did notice that there was a mark on the back of the head that was consistent with a blow from a blunt instrument. You can see the head's turned back and there's an obvious ligature mark around the throat. It's fairly clear that it looks like a very thin nylon cord because of the way that the striations in the ligature appear. She has her mouth open and there's clearly something in her mouth. It wasn't clear if she'd been strangled or suffocated by whatever it was that had been rammed down her throat. She's young, she's an attractive girl. She was somebody that didn't deserve to die.
Sydney police are investigating the murder of a young woman whose body has been found at Arncliffe in the city's south.
Two cyclists found the woman's fully clothed body lying by a road at 7:30 this morning. Police believe the woman was murdered sometime between 3 and 5 days ago.
One of the things we noticed very early in the piece was that the hands seemed to be mummified. They'd certainly been dried out, which suggested that this body had been stored somewhere else. So this was clearly a secondary crime scene. It wasn't where the body was killed. We did extensive canvassing of the scene. In fact, we extended the canvas area to about 4 kilometres. The next step was to actually go back and start an incident room at Cogra Police Station. The key element in the inquiry then was actually getting a strategy that would help us identify this girl. given the time of the year, it was Christmas time, people are visiting each other, you would think that somebody would be missing this girl at that time of the year, given her age. She'd be someone's daughter. A boyfriend or girlfriend would notice as missing. Once we identified her, we'd probably identify the offender. The reality with most homicides is they're committed by people that know each other.
Detectives have stepped up efforts to identify the body of a young woman found murdered at Arncliffe.
Desperate to identify the body found dumped in Guess Avenue on Saturday, homicide police today dressed a store dummy in similar clothing.
Obviously we need a starting point in terms of a murder investigation here, and until we identify, that's going to be difficult to do.
Described as 17 to 23 years old, the young dark-haired woman was wearing a white bodysuit, check hot pants and pink socks.
Good? Thank you. 3.
My name's Norm Lipson. I'm what you'd call a veteran journalist, and I've covered a hell of a lot of crime in this city and other places. Mick had a very good relationship with the media. They couldn't identify the victim and he was desperate. So he got experts to enhance her features, her face, and release that to the media.
Yeah, these are photographs that we had the ABC prepare. Unfortunately, this one sort of shows the girl looking like she's got sideburns, so it wasn't a great look. But we worked with what we had. While all this was going on, Kirk Waters from Police Scientific and our pathologist were doing a post-mortem on the body. The first item of interest was the object that was found in the girl's throat. Kirk Waters and Dr. Duflo very carefully removed the paper from the throat, and this is where we actually got a bit of a shock, I suppose, was the volume of paper that was down the throat. It was a full-size broadsheet from a Sydney Morning Herald. The paper is interesting though in that there appears to be fingerprints on it. Based on the colour of the fingerprints, a good chance they might be in blood. We, at this stage, believe we might even have the offender's fingerprints, and we'll probably identify the offender before we've identified the victim.
The bruised and battered body was found dumped in plastic bags at Arncliffe. A newspaper had been stuffed inside her mouth.
When they removed that and opened it up, there was 3 fingerprints in blood on that Sydney Morning Herald page.
We were pretty confident we might get a result from these fingerprints. It was run through the system and we got about 50 suspects. But after manual examination by the fingerprint experts, these were all discounted. So at that point we think we have an offender, but probably not somebody who has a criminal history. The next phase of the inquiry was actually where to go from there. I was allocated investigators, and ultimately by day 3 I had about 10, including Fiona Martin, who would follow me through to conclusion.
I first met Mick Platecki in 1981 at the Redfern Police Academy. We were in the same class and we graduated together. It was a great case to be involved in. A lot of very thorough work had been done, but detectives were stumped because they couldn't identify Jane Doe. I was assigned to the team that were looking at the missing person reports. There were hundreds of missing person reports to go through. We had to identify something within those reports that would link that person with the body of Jane Doe.
They pulled out something like 2,000 potential victims from the missing persons files. These they whittled down to around 700, which ultimately they managed to reconnect some of these missing girls with their families. That was good news for all those other families, but not so good for our own investigation.
No luck with Jane Doe. We weren't able to identify her.
By now, Police Scientific had established Jane Doe's time of death on either December the 23rd or December the 24th. We knew she'd been stored somewhere for at least 3 days before the killer had dumped the body in Arncliffe. It seems unusual that a girl can be missing since at least the 23rd and nobody's noticed. Yeah, there's certainly a time pressure to try and solve it quickly because at this stage we don't know whether it's one offender, several offenders, whether that person's still in the country, whether they've moved interstate or overseas. We're quite keen to actually try and identify an offender. In the case of her clothing, we were able to identify where the top was made. That was relatively common. The pants were less so. There were only about 27 of them made, and they only went to a particular outlet. We were able to track all but 2 pairs of those pants down to owners, which I thought was a remarkable job by my investigators. However, we also established that Jane Doe must have purchased one of the remaining pairs with cash. So that was an unfortunate part. The Seiko watch, we worked out that there had been about 600 of those sold across Australia and New Zealand. That led us to actually ask the New Zealand authorities to send us over girls that entered the country in the last 2 years. Again, with the watch though, it was that common. Unfortunately with 600, we weren't able to track down it any further than that. Another interesting lead was sand found in Jane Doe's pockets. We had police go around to all the popular beaches looking for samples of sand and seeing if we could compare it to the sand found on the body. Again, that was without result. We approached Victorian police because they had a program called FACE, which is a facial composition program that basically replaced sketch artists. Victorian police were very cooperative. They sent us back an image. The new image, as well as other images we'd produced, were distributed for another big push in the media.
So the media would run these photos and he kept going and going and going. And he used the media so much that his colleagues ended up calling him Hollywood. But he had to, he had no choice. As a result of Mick Platecki's many appeals to the media, they got hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. Unfortunately, at that stage, they didn't turn into anything. The investigative team had been cut in half. He wasn't going to give up. He had no intention of giving up on this case, but he needed time. So he went to his boss and begged for extra time. They were going to make this a cold case. This was going to go on the back burner.
With any investigations like this, detectives have to go to the next job. It's just a fact.
By April, we're really pushing it. There was pressure from above. We're starting to really get frustrated.
He was given another couple of weeks.
We were still at a loss as to her identity. So not much more could be done at that stage.
Mick's wife was also a police officer, and Mick would go home and discuss this with his wife constantly. And his wife came up with a great idea.
My wife's out of the class behind me at the academy, and we actually met at the academy. She's a fairly no-nonsense sort of a person. So when you come home and you're actually talking about jobs, she can usually pick, something in there that you can use. We were talking about it one night. Most my wife pointed out to me, she doesn't read the paper. She gets her news from the magazines. She suggested that really I should be focusing there, and it was a brilliant suggestion. So we contacted New Idea, who were quite happy to run the story. In fact, they actually ran it early so that we could get in before the Easter show.
And the story was based on Mick and his wife and wanting to solve this case. But they ran a more enhanced photograph of the victim, and it gave them the results they needed. Lara was a 17-year-old sex worker from King's Cross. Now, Lara was apparently flicking through New Idea and she came across this story. She looked at the photo and it looked familiar. And she said to herself, that's my friend Vivian Ruiz.
A breakthrough today in the puzzle of Jane Doe, the woman found murdered at Arncliffe 3 days after Christmas last year. She has finally been named as 22-year-old King's Cross dancer Vivian Ruiz.
It's taken 4 months for police to reveal the real name of the murdered girl they nicknamed Jane Doe. The young King's Cross dancer's memory was jogged by these police images of the dead girl. She was then identified as Vivian Linda Ruiz.
We lived together for 3 years, and then we both got a boyfriend and she just changed. Just shocked. Everyone thought she was overseas, but
But it turns out Lara had known Vivian for some time. She said she'd come from Spain originally. She'd moved down from the Gold Coast.
Through Lara, we were able to contact an uncle who lived on the Gold Coast.
The uncle had told us that Vivian's family had migrated from Spain when Vivian was 12 years old. Very bright girl, he said. She could speak a couple of languages. She was extremely intelligent, but unfortunately when she got out here, her mother and father had broken up.
Her father was a gambler. He was a womanizer, and Vivian grew up a bit by herself. She ran with the street kids and she was a bit out of control. The parents ultimately divorced in 1989 and they went back to Europe separately. The mother went to France with her boyfriend and Vivian wanted to go with her, but the mother didn't let her go because of her behaviour.
From what I can gather, Vivian had not taken that breakup well. And then she decided to travel to Perth with two friends. They got as far as Sydney, and I suppose it's an old story with young people. They get attracted to the nightlife at King's Cross, and she stayed in King's Cross. Lara gave us a lot of detail about Vivian's life in King's Cross. She originally started off here as a waitress. She moved into dancing because it paid better, and then unfortunately from there moved into prostitution.
She became a prostitute because it was quick money to save for a trip to Europe to see her family.
Lara revealed some very valuable information to us. Vivian had a boyfriend, a chap by the name of Richard White. Thank you. Yes, this is a photo of Richard. Richard was an unusual character. He went by the nickname Luke, but he was known around King's Cross as Sick Luke. Even in this photo, I've got to admit, there's something about his eyes that always concerns me. He had this unusual stare that really stuck out. He sort of always seemed to be staring off into the distance.
Now, Richard White was a gym junkie. He took steroids. He was a French polisher by trade, and he was a dope dealer. He dealt in ecstasy and marijuana and hung around the cross. And apparently, from what I know, he was a sex addict as well.
In fact, he bragged about having sex in the main street of King's Cross and in the alleys of King's Cross with not only Vivian, but also with other girls. He was a fellow who was quite handy with his fists. He was also a fellow who was known to have punched Vivian on occasions and be violent with her.
Vivian, from all accounts, was very quick with the tongue, and his answer was to bash her. And at times, it became so violent that furniture in their flat was broken.
Lara told us that Richard and Vivian shared a flat together in Victoria Street, Potts Point. In mid-December, they moved to nearby Hampton Court, and soon after that, Vivian was killed, either on the 23rd or the 24th of December.
Vivian had saved a large amount of money in a shoebox in her wardrobe. A few days after her murder, Richard White deposited a large amount of money into his bank account, which was unusual because he hadn't had any money in his bank account prior to this for months.
Mick Platecki had his main suspect now. They'd identified the victim, and he had the suspect, who was Richard White.
We soon established that Richard White had a police file. He'd previously been charged with stealing and, more significantly, assault. But when Detective Cole Terry checked the prints we had on file against the bloody prints on the newspaper, they were close. But they were not identical. We were at that point disappointed, but Cole was quite dogged. There was something about the print that didn't seem right to him, so he contacted Barry Fay, who was the boss of the fingerprint section. Something must have triggered in his mind about tonal reversal.
Now, tonal reversing, when you take somebody's fingerprints, you're taking the prints of the ridges of their fingers. What happened was, when Richard White stuffed that paper with force with his left hand down her throat, the blood went into the valleys of the fingerprint rather than the ridges. So what you had was a reverse, like a negative, a reverse of the fingerprint. Once Barry Fay reversed it, it matched Richard White.
At this stage, we're pretty confident we have our murderer. The fingerprints match Richard White. The question now is, where is Richard White?
We sent a traffic sergeant around to Richard White's parents' address on the pretext that he had traffic matters outstanding. And so this traffic sergeant found out that Richard White had gone overseas.
He travelled to Thailand, and from there, through Interpol, we were able to establish he went to the Philippines, Malaysia, and then on to England. We knew that he had relatives there, so we went through the phone records of the White family and determined that he was in Newcastle-on-Tyne. We contact the expedition squad of the Metropolitan Police, and I'm put in touch with a Detective Sergeant Les Bone.
We identified where the phone calls were coming from was a street in Walker, which was a sort of rundown area of Newcastle. We travelled to Newcastle and liaised with the local police. I then made inquiries in pubs and clubs around Newcastle because Mick had told me that this is the sort of haunts that he used to hang around in Sydney. Spoke to several bar people, and this barmaid in one of the pubs, she says, when I showed them the photograph, she says, he's Australian, isn't he? So we then knew that he was definitely in Newcastle.
He then does a canvass of the street where Richard is, using a husky-voiced policewoman to ring up and say that they're checking on a sexual assault.
We were outside sitting in a nondescript police vehicle. So we were up and through the door, and there he was, still with the phone in his hand. and I advised him that I was in possession of a warrant for his arrest for the murder of Vivian Ruiz.
When he was arrested, it was coordinated so that Les would ring me as soon as he was in custody, and we would then execute the warrant at the house at Bexley. Timing was important here. We were very keen to search Richard's parents' place for additional evidence. But we don't want to do it until Richard's in custody. We don't want Richard to tip anybody off when he's in custody so they can get rid of evidence. We went round to the White's house. The house was interesting. We found notes about wanting to follow his sexual urges. We found fairly erotic photographs of him and Vivian in various sexual positions. It was a house that was set on a hill, and it had a sort of a basement area in the foundations where Richard did his French polishing. And there was a sandy area right up towards where the floor and the foundations met that was quite sandy and covered in lime, which seemed unusual. So we took samples of the sand and the lime there. And we sent those samples to the lab to see if we had a match to the sand we had found in Vivian's pocket.
The man wanted over the murder of Sydney dancer Vivian Ruiz has appeared in a London court. 23-year-old Richard White from Bexley was arrested yesterday, 4 months after the killing of the woman dubbed Jane Doe. He'd been staying with relatives in the northern city of Newcastle and will face a Sydney court within a month.
We made arrangements with the airline that when we got back, they would try and get us off first as a priority. And I can remember when we taxied in, it was the typical thing that happens with planes. Everybody got up at once, despite the fact that the hostess was saying, can you please all stay in your seats? We've got to get some people off first. And as we're walking down the aisle, I'm 5'8". I had this man gorilla behind me, but he's handcuffed to me. I can remember holding up my hand and the aisle cleared like the parting of the Red Sea.
After being escorted from London by Sydney Homicide Police, White was formally charged today with murdering his girlfriend, dancer and prostitute Vivian Ruiz.
Once back, it was really a case then of getting him before the coroner, and the matter's then committed to the courts so that it can be resolved by trial. I actually like committals because they actually give you a chance to test the evidence.
So far, police have been unable to interview Richard White, whose lawyer says he's refusing to speak, exercising his right to remain silent. He's also refusing to undergo any medical tests.
We did have an issue arise over an application we made to obtain hair and blood samples from Richard White. His legal counsel, Lee Johnson, had persuaded White to fight this application.
Now, I've advised him not to consent to that, and there's an issue, as I say, as to whether or not they have the right to do that.
Police say they will take hair and blood samples unless blocked by the Supreme Court. White's lawyer says that dispute is likely to be settled tomorrow.
This was a roadblock for the case, and as it turned out, the first of many. In the committal hearing for Richard White's murder charge, Defence Counsel Lee Johnson objected to our application to take hair and blood samples from her client. This is something that we're entitled to do under the New South Wales Crimes Act.
The police want to take hair and blood samples, and we've agreed to have it determined in the Supreme Court.
I said, do your best. She relented, and we took the hair without any great incident after that. Richard's behaviour became erratic. He attempted to actually delay the trial quite a bit. He was eating flies in front of the jury, making random offhanded remarks that seemed to have no relevance to the proceedings. On one occasion, he actually kicked out the door of the dock, and jumped on the crown table and started masturbating. Yeah, it seemed to us that he was preparing a defence of mental illness. And that's why we actually then called in Dr. Milton to actually do a psychological assessment of him. Rod Milton came up with the fact that he thought he was borderline schizophrenic. He was of the view that he was probably unfit to stand trial. So the trial was delayed for quite a while he was being treated. The prosecution had a series of setbacks in the trial relating to key evidence we'd gathered at the time of Vivian's murder. We thought we'd match the dog hairs found on Vivian's shorts to the White's family dog in Bexley. But the evidence was discounted at trial because the defence argued the hairs may have come from another German Shepherd. We determined that he had a van and that he'd sold a van that he used for his French polishing. We were quite lucky. The new owner hadn't cleaned it out in any great detail. The van was completely forensically examined. What we did find was a smattering of blood on the differential cover at the front of the van. And by the time of the retrial in 1996, DNA testing had shown beyond doubt the blood in the van was Vivian's.
This indicated to us that at some stage the body of Vivian had been transported in that van.
Unfortunately, at trial it was argued that evidence should be discounted, and the argument was from the defence we'd collected that material before DNA existed, and in preparing it for DNA, scientific people had added water to it. And the argument was, well, how do we know the water wasn't contaminated? So, unfortunately, the DNA evidence was discounted. The nature of police work is that there's a lot of work that's sidelined and you can't take it personally, you've just got to work through it. This wasn't the first case where these sort of things had happened. You have to work with the rules you've got, and that's exactly what we did. Ultimately, the fingerprint still was our key piece of evidence, and it was the best evidence because a tonal print can only go on there with pressure. And when you look at where that print was found in her throat, in a broadsheet of newspaper, there was no other conclusion that you could draw but that he's placed that piece of paper in her throat. Before her murder, Vivian lived with Richard in a flat on Victoria Street, Potts Point. They moved out of the flat on December the 16th, 1991. His story is that he's helping her pack up her stuff and that somewhere along the line he injures himself while he's wrapping stuff in Sydney Morning Herald paper. They'd moved at Hampton Court, and from there, Vivian disappears. Vivian was supposed to have met Richard's family on Christmas Eve.
And she'd actually sent presents with Richard over to their home about a week prior to Christmas. On Christmas Eve, Richard told his family that Vivian wasn't going and that they should unwrap their presents. And over that Christmas period, Richard told them that they'd had an argument, they'd broken up, and that she was going to France by herself.
Richard gave various stories to various people. At a dance party in Sydney on New Year's Eve, 3 days after Vivian's body was found, Richard told an associate that Vivian was going to France alone, but that he was staying in Sydney. That was a lie. The truth of the matter was he'd cancelled both their plane tickets to Europe and then rebooked himself with another travel agent to fly out of Australia on January the 2nd. After hearing all the evidence and closing arguments, Justice Hidden retired to consider his verdict. The accused, Richard White, had requested a judge-only trial. If you know Darlinghurst, it's an old Victorian building, beautiful old wooden fixtures in it. I was sitting in the reporter's box, which is opposite where the jury normally sits. It's sort of a very atmospheric spot. The judge comes out in his wigs and gown and starts reading out his dissertation as to the evidence and what weight he put on the evidence. And you look back on what you've done and you think, have we done everything we possibly could do? When a judge brings down a verdict, he's not just deciding on guilt or innocence, he's deciding on the professionalism of the police and how they do their job. There were only a few people in the courtroom to bear witness when Justice Hidden handed down his verdict. When he's doing that, you can't help but wonder if you've done enough, because it's a bit of a lottery until he actually says at the end, guilty or not guilty.
A 27-year-old man has been jailed for at least 10 years for Sydney's so-called Jane Doe murder. Richard White strangled Vivienne Ruiz in 1991, wrapping her body in garbage bags before dumping it at Arncliffe in the city's south. She was known only as Jane Doe until her body was identified nearly 4 months later.
You become attached to the victim when you're working on homicide inquiries. You want to see justice done for them. Looking at her family history, you know, you can't help feeling a bit of sympathy for the fact that had things been different, had her mother stayed in Australia with her, had she have made different life choices, this would not have happened to her. Young people do make mistakes. Choosing to be up at King's Cross and choosing to take on a lifestyle as a dancer and a prostitute shouldn't be a death sentence. And in this case, it was.
She's met this abusive man who has bashed her on a regular basis and ultimately killed her one day.
I believe he's a sociopath. I believe that he's a narcissist. He cared about what made him feel good and happy. He didn't care about anybody else. That's the hallmark of an evil person, I believe.
He's never shown any remorse for the killing of Vivienne, and he's never admitted to the killing.
We had a witness who came forward who had shared a cell with Richard. And Richard had, by and large, highlighted to him how he'd killed Vivienne. He said he'd brought her home on Christmas Eve. Parents weren't home at that stage. He'd taken her down into his workshop. He asked her to hold a frame up on the wall while he was doing something with it because of his work. He then hit her over the back of the head with a baseball bat, then strangled her and put newspaper down her throat. The chilling thing that he said was that when he put the newspaper down her throat, he wasn't sure whether he'd actually killed her by strangulation firsthand. So she would have had a very horrible death with this wad of newspaper suffocating her. Hopefully he's been treated for his mental illness, and hopefully he's moved on and is living a more productive life. And that's the hard part. You can't atone for a life you take. How does he fix that? It wasn't just Vivienne who was a victim in this case, it was also Richard's parents. Richard's actions had stolen from them the son that they hoped he'd be and all the aspirations they had for their son.
They were in court today, prepared to place their house as security for his release.
Well, seeing he's innocent, he's bearing up very well.
They were very, very loyal to him right to the end.
One day his name will be cleared. If it takes 5, 10, 20 years, his name will be cleared and he will be vindicated.
I can remember thinking, well, no, you're not. And, I still felt so sorry for her. She was just, her and her husband were just such decent people. My oldest daughter's actually a high school teacher, but my middle daughter's a police officer now, and my son's at the police academy at the moment. My daughter absolutely loves the work, and my son, he's already talking about where he wants to be in 3 or 4 years' time, so I think that's good.
The tragic story of Jane Doe began when the body of a woman was found covered in plastic bags under a railway pass at Arncliffe. It took an intensive police publicity campaign to finally establish her identity, Vivian Ruiz.
The sad part with Vivian was she was buried in a pauper's grave. There was very few people, to mourn her. You can't help but feeling she was a girl lost. Richard has stolen everything from her, everything she was and could be. She was somebody that didn't deserve to die.
She'd had a hard life. The final injustice for her was that she was missing from people's lives for 4 months and no one thought to go looking for her. She was only 22. She was a young girl. So it's the sadness of her life